everybody, Justin from Silence in the Storm here. Today we're going to talk about something I'm terming the ideal self and how that is used by us to propel ourselves forward along a track of personal evolution and character development. And I'm going to describe this within a framework of the lower self or the altered self versus the higher self, or kind of like the soul or spiritual self. So before I do that, I just want to thank all of my new Patreons and welcome those to my channel who haven't been here before. And what we're going to get into is a discussion about these topics. Now, this isn't the only way to describe these things. It's just one interpretation, so I'm not presenting an absolutist viewpoint here. So first, what we're going to do is define these different aspects of self, and then I'm going to talk about how we use the ideal self to move us forward along a track of evolution. So the higher self is something that it was a term that I became familiar with as a result of the Law of One, although I'm pretty sure it's been used in various different ways throughout history. And I'm going to define the higher self as the kind of the soul archetype, your soul blueprint, so to speak. And in the Law of One, they describe how the higher self exists in a kind of a futurized version of yourself, or a future version of yourself, where you've basically faced all your challenges, you've done all your shadow work, and you've kind of reached this like maximum state of evolution within this particular octave of the universe or creation. So it's not the be-all, end-all. It's not the ultimate self, but it's the highest place you can get to within this sphere of evolution that's happening in our densities of creation, our octave of creation. And for those who aren't familiar with those terms, what that basically means is that if you can think about the universe as a kind of spectrum, so you have source at the very, very top, then you have what source created, which is the creation. So when I say source, I mean God, or the creator. And then the creator created this kind of branching network of regions of creation for parts of itself that it divides into souls and soul groups to then find expression. And an octave of that creation is a place where an element of the creator spark, a personality archetype, can find expression from the very small aspects of creation. So like molecules that move into, or atoms and molecules that then move into cells, and microscopic life like microbes, which then move into macroscopic life like plants and animals, which then move into the human order life, which allows an actual mind to come in and start to guide the evolution in a conscious way. And then that continues on until basically the individuals, through their own self-work and self-mastery, form these networks with each other that then interface with the planet itself to form what's called the social memory complex. And then that evolution progresses along several densities to get to the point where they've reached a maximum point where they've basically done as much work as they possibly can in that order, that octave. That's what I just described as an octave of creation in the Law of One a depiction. And then they move on into some next phase of the creation. So there are 7 densities for that kind of evolution of consciousness to progress. So when I talk about the higher self kind of resides in what's called the 6th density. So right now, we're in the 3rd density. And to go over that again real quick. Yeah, first density is basically atoms, particles, and molecules. And then second density is microbes up to the unconscious animal and plant level life. When I say unconscious, is that they don't possess the same degree and focal point and self-awareness as human beings do, although they are arguably self-aware. But in the Law of One terminology, or in the Law of One system, they don't possess the capacity to self-direct through what we would call like an ego or a persona. And just to put a small caveat on that, I know there's a lot of talk about the ego being a really bad thing, and when I'm saying the term ego, I'm just defining you as you relate to yourself, your identity, who you think you are. And animal in the second octave or sorry, not octave, second density, their capacity to identify who they are is more of a physical kind of like automatic or instinctual aspect. They don't necessarily possess self-consciousness in the same way a human being does, which is the third density of evolution in this scheme. And what the density that we're in right now is all about the choice, as in who do you think you are and who do you want to be. And then later on, and we'll just take a moment on that, this is where the ideal self concept is going to nest in, and then the ideal self continues on up through other orders of evolution. So then in the fourth density you have human beings who have kind of reached a higher state. They've reached some degree of self-mastery in their personality, and they've made some kind of choice either to service others or service themselves. And those things probably should be defined too, but I'm not going to have a chance to do that in this video. And then they start to work with the planetary consciousness to blend itself and the planetary consciousness with themselves. Not to say that they cease being individual beings, creatures, but they begin to take on greater influences and have more of a perception to understand the more mindful, the more abstract, the more conscious aspects of existence. And then that continues on into fifth density. And then in sixth density, that's where the service to self and service to other path blend, so to speak, or more specifically, that's when you only can get so far with service to self consciousness path evolution before you reach a point where it just starts to break down and you have to go back into the unity aspect of working with service to others, because that's ultimately what the universe does. So the universe allows you, because of the law of free will, to go on a course of service to self, but eventually you have to come back. And that's where the higher self resides. So when I talk about the higher self, we're talking about this aspect of you that has kind of already made all these hurdles forward, these growth jumps forward along massively long tracks of time, arguably millions and potentially billions of years. Okay, so that's the higher self. The ego self, or your self-identity or your persona, your character, who you are now, is who you think of yourself as. You know, when you sit and you reflect on yourself, either in the mirror or just sitting quietly in meditation, and you think about, well, who am I? That's the ego self. And again, this is a massive discussion, but I just want to define that as who you think of yourself to be in these situations where you go and act and do things. That is where the definition of you lives out. So for example, if you think of yourself as an artist and you kind of put that in your bag of personality traits that define who you are. So for myself, I'll describe myself here. I think of myself as a philosopher, a writer, somebody who appreciates science and discovery and research. So because I define myself in that way, I put those character traits in the bag of self that I define as me. So when I go into situations where those character traits can be lived out, I lean into that and I feel good in doing so because of something called the reward mechanism. So when you do move towards something, a goal that you have defined for yourself and you want to do, you willingly choose to embrace, it makes you feel good, and there's a whole set of biological and neurological mechanisms that propel you forward in that track. Because that's kind of what we're all here to do, is strive towards who we think we want to be. And so that's what the ego self is. The ideal self is, so you take your ego self, and that's kind of like the base of the pyramid, so to speak. So you have, let's say you have who you want to be, who you think of yourself as, but then there's who you really are, right? And that kind of can reside below the surface, so to speak, in the kind of subconscious. So you may tell yourself that you're a really kind and loving and nurturing person, but be honest with yourself. Is that something that you express in every moment that you have to do that? And likely you don't all the time. Likely there's aspects of your shadow self that manifest things that you aren't necessarily consciously aware of, things that you haven't consciously defined, that hide behind the surface, and they come out when you lose control or when you get misguided or things like this. So you have your ego self, which is kind of like in the middle. Then you have your ideal self, which is where you want to be. So when you think of yourself as, let's say you want to be a service to others type of person. You want to be moral, you want to be harmless, you want to be nurturing and unconditionally loving. And that's kind of like the narrow path, that really high self, or the highly idealized version of yourself that you want to be. And that could also include like physical attributes. Let's say, maybe you want to be a strong, physically strong person. You want to be not overweight, or maybe you want to look a certain way. You want to be youthful, healthy, that kind of thing. So all those are in the ideal self. So when I say ideal self, I don't necessarily mean this kind of like completely abstract, highly spiritual version of yourself. I mean the best person that you can envision for yourself. So that's at the top of the pyramid, the narrow path. And then you have who you think you are. And then you have the shadow self. And as I just was mentioning, the shadow self is the parts of you that you probably learned and picked up in character traits of yourself that you developed in your past through either your programming or your environmental conditioning, or you were trying to be a vision of yourself that maybe has changed, so your ideal self can change. So maybe when you were younger, let's say, you really wanted to be a musician, and the idea of being a musician and being famous and having influence over a lot of people seemed like really important to you. But you've grown since then, and now that ideal just doesn't really hold sway on you. And now you don't necessarily want to be a world famous person. Maybe you're just happy to have a family, or you're happy to be a teacher, you're happy to work the job you're working, or whatever ideal version of yourself that is now. So the point I'm making here is that your ideal self is it's a goal. It's something you consciously envision in your mind and contemplate and think about and imagineer. Okay, and when you have the vision of that you say you want to do, then you can shift and you can move to a new blueprint of self that you're trying to live out. So the ideal self is kind of like the blueprint. It's the thing that you're trying to build with your ego self. And your ego acts, and I'm going to define it a little bit different way than what you've probably heard before. Your ego acts in the moment, in the sense that who you think of yourself as now, you have to work in the moment to make choices right here, right now, to live out who you say you want to be in the future, your ideal self. So for example, if you want to be, I'll give something specific. Let's say if you want to be a musician, well, you got to spend time right here and now, in the moment. You got to work this into your schedule to practice music, to pick up an instrument, to learn songs, to learn the mechanics of what music is, so that you can actually reach the ideal version of yourself that you've set in your goals. So the shadow self could be elements, older aspects of those programs you've been building through the creation in the now that aren't necessarily in alignment. So for example, when we are traumatized, when we're hurt or afflicted by other people in our lives, we tend to kind of slip into an altered state. And we could become very self-defensive, we could become abusive, we could become really nasty, malevolent people as a defense mechanism. Well, because that happens in the now, we literally program our subconscious with those personality types, those alters. And those alters could rear themselves up in different situations throughout life. If you're, for example, if you're somebody who thinks of yourself as a really good person and you're really loving, but then when you get into traffic, all of a sudden this like road rage aspect of yourself comes out, and you find yourself acting in a way that you feel like you normally wouldn't, or you don't want to, then that's an aspect of your shadow self. You're the shadow you. So what an alter is a really interesting concept, and I'll probably do a whole video series just about alters because it's fascinating, and it's something I think for people who want to evolve their consciousness, it can be very helpful to understand. An alter is kind of like a carbon copy of yourself. So a really good movie that depicts this concept well is the sequel to Tron, and in that Tron movie, the creator of for those of you who don't know what Tron is this movie about this programmer who creates this kind of digital world where these other programs and these beings live, and they have this kind of whole universe, this whole world in the world. And in that movie, he created a copy of himself to kind of govern the world, an alter version of himself. And then that altered version kind of turns dark and malevolent. And 20 years later, when he goes back, or his son goes back into the world, the world that he created has been taken over by this tyrant who is this altered version of the creator. And the creator is actually trapped in the creation in this sense, and it's his son that actually has to go in and kind of face this altered version of himself, which you could argue is like the dark Lucifer, Satan archetype, and then kind of liberate the creator. It's that in and of it. I mean, that film is filled with all sorts of beautiful allegories. So, but the point I'm getting at here is, when in these moments when you feel traumatized and altered, or when you feel traumatized, where you feel like your conscious mind, your ego self, that has, the ability to think, to be rational, that is using the neocortex and not just relying on the animal senses of the brain like the R complex and the limbic system, or the limbic brain, when that breaks down because trauma has been inflicted on you, because you're being abused, because you feel threatened, then what tends to happen is the neocortex literally shuts down, and then an altered version of yourself, that carbon copy, will come to the surface, usually a not so nice version of yourself, to deal with whatever the situation is. So that's what an alter is. Okay, so now here I am, 17 minutes in the video. Now we're actually going to get to the meat of the video, which is, well, what is the ideal self? And how is it going to help us propel forward? Well, as I mentioned, the ideal self is that the goal of yourself that you think of yourself that you want to be. So what's important about the ideal self is you have to build an impression. You have to consciously think about what the ideal self is. What character traits does it have? How does it operate in the world? So you can do this as an exercise. So I'll implore you to do this exercise. I want you to think of a situation in your life. Let's say maybe you're going to the supermarket and you're at a cashier, and the cashier is just really nasty and rude and unforgiving and gives you these dirty looks. Ask yourself, well, who would you want to be in that scenario? Now, in order to answer that question, you have to think of, well, who is the ideal self? If you want to be an unconditionally loving person, if you want to be service to others, if you want to be a moral, harmless, nurturing person, so somebody that's going to help this person that's in this dark moment, the cashier in this case, kind of transcend that and heal them. If that's the person you say you want to be, then play a scenario. Have a moment of fantasy. Have a moment of play acting, so to speak, where you're going to try to, in your own imagination, embody your ideal self and give it life in a scenario. And then what that does is, because you're using your conscious mind to think about these things, the conscious mind is the programmer. So it's actually going to program your subconscious. Every time you do something and make a choice, free will actually creates a new mental program that then settles into your subconscious, and then now you draw upon that. So really, you could argue that the whole task of evolving your soul, evolving your consciousness, is trying to use your conscious mind to make the choices that are in alignment with your idealized version of self, so that you're constantly filling your subconscious, the base of your personality pyramid, so to speak, with programs, so that in the future, you're acting more in alignment with your ideals and your values. So that's what the ideal self is all for. It's a guiding point. It's a compass. It's something that moves you and helps you move forward in situations. Now, what's important is also to realize that the ideal self has to change. Again, who you idealize yourself to be when you were 5 years old is probably not who you envision yourself to be, or the ideal version of yourself that you want to be now. Maybe it's not, and it most definitely is not the one that's going to be in the future, especially if you're doing the truth-seeking work. If you're actively expanding your knowledge, then what's happening is you're grasping on new values and new understandings, and then with that new value and understanding, you're creating practical ways to use that information. And that's what truth, when you take truth and you find a practical way to use it, and then you actually do that, that's what wisdom is. So let's say you chose the path of service to others. You want to be a moral person. You want to unconditionally love. You want to heal people. Well, in those moments where or let me take a moment to step back here. It's really easy to be idealistic about who you say you want to be in moments where there's no challenge. But it's a real test of your character, or in other words, it's a test of how much you've actually accomplished. If you put yourself in scenarios, or you think about scenarios where it's not so easy. So for example, it's really easy to be loving and nurturing with people who are nice and easy to get along with, and are courteous and respectful. It's not so necessarily easy to be unconditionally loving and nurturing, helping when you're dealing with a nasty, malevolent, rude, disrespectful person. So this is where embracing all of the aspects and your circumstances of life can be really handy, because it's what it's going to do is it's going to allow you to test your mettle, so to speak. It's going to allow you to test your process for trying to reach the ideal self, and it's going to give you insights in the moment, in the now, to then tailor or change the blueprint of self you're striving towards. So let's say, as an example, that you think the ideal self is somebody that's detached, that never interacts with negativity, that never has to deal with any problems that are battles or arguments that are happening in the world where two people are really raging at each other because you think those things are negative. And I picked this example because this is a major aspect of the awakening movement, especially the New Age movement, where a lot of people just kind of have this detached way of being where they want to interact with the world. And I understand that, because there's value to that choice. It's hard if you don't have the tools to be that kind, loving, nurturing, unforgiving, ideal version of yourself in those kind of dark battle moments. Then your shadow self can come to the surface, and before you know it, you're in an altered state, and you're being nasty and malevolent, and you don't want to feel that way. So it's all in balance. A way to train yourself. So instead of going to the battlefield of real experience and trying to live out this ideal version of yourself without any training, take some time to sit quietly and meditate on scenarios that allow you to test your mettle. So like I was saying, imagine that you're talking to maybe a cashier that's really nasty and malevolent. What do you think you're going to try to do to cheer that person up, to help them, to heal them? And create a plan for yourself, create a method of you trying to actually do that, and then try to give that scenario life in your own mind, and then reflect on how that actually plays out. I do this constantly. This is something that I've been doing since I was a small child. I'm always imagining different social scenarios and how I will act in them, and trying to differentiate between who I want to be and who I actually am. And admittedly, there's times where my shadow self comes out and I imagine myself being attacked, and I'm like, getting all like really angry and, like really putting that person in their place. But even that is valuable, because in the safety of your own mind, you can give those expressions to your shadow self. This is what shadow work is all about. So that you can actually integrate that and first realize that you have a shadow self. If you can't acknowledge the truth of your own being, if you don't think you have a tyrant, a malevolent, nasty, hateful person inside of you, then you're probably deluding yourself to some degree, because we each have that shadow aspect of ourselves, that beast. But when we tame the beast, when we tame the dragon, now we can use the power of that dragon and direct that energy in a benevolent, in a service to others way. So then once you actually do some internal imagineering about this, then you can actually go out into the world, once you've trained yourself a little bit, and actually try to do this work. And what you'll likely find is that you're not necessarily a master at these things. You got some work to do. You tried to be this ideal version of yourself. Let's say you actually lived out the imagined ideal version that you had contemplated, but it wasn't effective. The person the cashier didn't get cheered up. You didn't actually have a healing effect. Well, first you have to consider the truth, which is that there's free will at play. So you could try all you might to cheer somebody up and heal them, but it's their choice whether they accept it. So there's free will to consider. Secondly, you have to consider your skills. Even if they are willing to accept your wisdom and your ministry and your healing, are you skilled enough to deliver that to them? And this is more of what I wanted to focus on in this segment, is that your ability to give life to these desires and these values requires a practical plan. You actually have to have skills to offer. So to use a specific example, let's say you want to be a triage doctor. You want to help sew people's wounds and know how to give CPR and all these things. Well, if you don't know how to do that, then you lack the skills. And if you go to try to do it and you don't do a good job, then what that is, that in that moment, is that's the universe showing you that you have work to do. And this is where the inner work comes in. You invoke humility, which is a feminine quality of receptiveness to the truth, that allows you to then look at your plan of action and say, oh, you know what, I tried to we'll go back to the cashier example. I tried to cheer that cashier up. It seemed like they were willing, but I didn't say something that maybe I was too brazen. Maybe I wasn't listening to them enough, because oftentimes when you're trying to help people, you just sitting there and listening and allow them to feel like what their inner world matters to another person is often like the bulk of the work. It's only after they've discharged that energy and actually feel like somebody cares that you can start to slowly give them pieces of advice and information that they then have to use to help themselves. So you're not actually helping anybody in a forcing them to change sense. It's that you're just nurturing their ability to change themselves. So to get back to my point here, that skill set requires mastery. So what you're actually doing is you're learning how to change the plan, learning how to change your skill set so you can have better adeptness, better proficiency with how you actually help and minister people in this context. And then lastly, if you go to live out this plan you have for yourself, you're in the battlefield of real experience, so to speak, or you're in the testing ground, if you don't like that term, battlefield, and you're trying to see how skilled you actually are, then you might find out, well, your ideal version of self that you've created isn't actually a good one. Maybe there's a better version. Maybe there's a more complete version, a more specific, highly detailed. So that's the other thing, is that when you're creating this ideal version of yourself, you say you want to be service to others, you say you want to be harmless and nurturing and caring. Well, those are great ideals, but they're highly abstract. They're not specific. What does a service to self person actually look like? What do they actually do in life circumstance? How do they take that high ideal and give it a valid plan of action that actually gives them the skills to live that out? So all of that's part of using the ideal self kind of and the other aspects of personality. And what's interesting is that the more of your ability to be truthful and to build coherent structures of meaning in your knowledge base that are in alignment with truth, that are coherent, the more your higher self can kind of drip in wisdom into your ideal self to then change and transmogrify or transmute the ideal self to be more in alignment with the actual higher self. And that's kind of the cosmic kind of spiritual aspect that's coming in here, is this work, the higher self, through dreams, through insights, through help putting, arguably putting you in life situations that test you to kind of make you humble, because sometimes we don't want to be humble. We think we have it all figured out, and then we get smacked around a little bit by the universe, and you're like, wait a minute, I gotta be humble because I don't have it all figured out. That's how the mechanism of personality and consciousness evolution kind of works, and this is what I'm arguing here. So, I think that using those tools can be very helpful. Really, I would argue, when I say argue, just to emphasize this, I'm not saying like argue, I'm right, you're wrong. An argument is just a model of reality that I have spent time contemplating through studying empirical evidence, contemplating the logic behind how these empirical pieces of evidence work, and then presenting an image or a map of meaning that seems to be congruent with reality that I'm presenting as a theorem to you, the audience. So everything I'm saying here is not some like dogma that I want you to blindly follow. It's something that I want you to think about and then please speak your mind, comment to me, show me how I may not be in alignment, show me how there may be pieces missing that I could be benefiting from, or even like additions to this model that could be more expansive and replete. So with that in mind, it's this mechanism that we have to guide our behavior and to realize our true potential has to come through recognizing the truth of who we are, so accepting the shadow, working with the moment. So instead of trying to discard the ego and never interacting with reality and trying to avoid situations that test your mettle because you don't want to be negative, you actually embrace those situations as much as you can in moderation to be the best person you think you are. And then once you give, and then you sit and contemplate and you meditate on what's actually happened in the past and an experience to say, well, maybe my ideal version of self needs some work. Maybe there's something I need to do to better improve who I think I am. And with those tools, these are tools I've used in my life. I would argue that in my study of psychology and philosophy and history and spirituality, what I've just described in this video is a model or a mechanism or blueprint for personality evolution that is echoed through many different works. And just to substantiate that with an anecdote, as some of you know, I've gone through a lot of shifts in my personal life. I used to be an addict. I was a heroin and cocaine addict for almost 4 years. I was doing all sorts of immoral, nasty things, stealing from people, stealing from my family, lying to everybody that I could to get advantage. And I had this profound shift in my character over the course of several years that eventually led me to this conscious realization of who I wanted to be when I started to become spiritual and I had my awakening. And which was in 2010, and I made a lot of leaps and bounds in that short time, but I'm still moving forward. I'm constantly having to humble myself, reflect on the things that I'm doing, and try to be the best person I can be. So ultimately what it boils down to is, if you strive to be the best person you can be, then, and honestly embrace that process, which isn't necessarily easy. It takes hard work to get your stuff together, to get your own house in order. Then not only can you master yourself and gain self-mastery, but then you can also start to help minister or serve others in that capacity. And I would argue that's what the great work at a personality level is all about. It's all about making ourselves better through embracing the truth, and then using that wisdom of embracing the truth to offer and nurture other people. And then we make the world and others a better place as a result. So thank you again for listening to this video. I appreciate any feedback and commentary you have. You can find my work at stillnessinthestorm.com. I appreciate any contributions you wish to make to me to keep this type of work going, which you can find on the website or through Patreon. And I want to encourage you to embrace the truth of your beingness, to blend the shadow, to embrace the tools of the now, which incorporates the ego, to consciously think about the ideal version, the best version of yourself that you want to be, and do that diligently with compassion and moderation. And in the act of doing so, you will conquer your demons and you will become the best version that you can be. So thanks everybody, much love, stay vigilant, stay truthful, and I'll see you on the other side.